Hi, in today's video, I want to talk about developments in land warfare having to do with the advent of high technology and what it actually means. Things like drones and C4ISR and precision strike and the sort of greater transparency in the modern battlefield. And so I thought it would be great to to have a conversation about all this with my friend Nicholas Drummond, who is a land warfare expert and has been working on the subject really for many decades. But rather than I introduce him, I thought it would be best actually to hand the mic, so to speak, over to Nicholas.
Hi, Michael, and good morning, and thanks for having me. By way of introduction, I served initially a first career in the British Army at the height of a Cold War, when Britain actually had an army, and served in Germany, in Cyprus, and various British Army stations, including Belize in Central America. So saw a very varied service in an army that was considerably bigger than it is today. I served 7 years and left as a captain, and really had a whole second career afterwards in management consulting, working with McKinsey before setting up my own firm in 2002. And then, really, without intending to, I worked with a couple of defense customers, and that really gave way to this sort of third career where I've been advising the defense industry on land warfare topics and capability building and acquisition processes. And that's really what I've been doing in full since 2014, and have been very much involved in British Army modernisation, but also in evolving doctrine and the way in which it intends to fight. So that's really where I'm coming from.
Excellent, thank you. So, in our conversations that you and I have been having now for several years, your imagination was piqued, if I can call it that, by an article I wrote many years ago about General Hubin's theories about the death of the homothetic army, and that sort of kind of helped fuel our conversation. So I thought that maybe it'd be good to begin with your thoughts on, well, what was it about Hubin's ideas that sparked your imagination?
Well, first of all, I mean, he very visionary in what he wrote. But I think what most caught my imagination was he talked about the gradual improvement of things, the incremental improvement can suddenly reach a tipping point that has a revolutionary effect. And he was just talking about that confluence of multiple technologies all advancing, suddenly enabling you to do things that you couldn't do before. And we had that at the beginning of World War II with Blitzkrieg, when the German army put radios in its tanks, and suddenly it could do things that it just couldn't do before, and was able to outflank a superior French army quite effectively, despite having inferior forces. So very interesting then. And now we've reached that point again today. There are a lot of technologies that contribute to that, but suddenly we really are seeing land warfare at a crossroads where it's changing substantially. The way in which we fight on the ground has evolved and will continue to evolve. So that's by way of introduction why I think his ideas were so important and relevant to what we're doing today.
So what do you think those technologies are?
Well, there are four technologies that have really had a significant effect. And the first of those is software-enabled C4I communication systems. And what these are doing are enabling armies to share information not only by voice, but also via data. So video, images, maps, the whole thing. So suddenly you can really have a richness in what you're able to tell your superiors about where you are, what you see, and what you're doing. And also, of course, the other great thing about software-enabled systems is that a network effect. And suddenly you have these deployed networks which connect sensors to effectors. And so these two things together really are immensely powerful. And it's created what people are calling information advantage. And I think this is the killer app of modern warfare. And this is where you have instant access to very accurate information. So you have better situational awareness. And if you have better situational awareness, you're able to take better decisions faster. And if you can take better decisions faster, then your command and control improves. And your whole ability to respond and respond effectively suddenly takes a quantum leap. And that's really what we're seeing. And the US achieved this in Iraq in 2003. And it was just a parade, really, for US forces in Iraq then, because they had great situational awareness, knew exactly where the enemy were. They could just march down and do whatever they wanted. And the same was true in Afghanistan. The networks that they had gave them this huge awareness. So that's the first thing, C4I systems making a big, big difference. And of course, the second really significant change that we're seeing is the advent of UAS drones and drone technology. And what this is doing, it's lifted the fog of war. And suddenly you can have multiple drones across the battlefield. Together, they're giving you this real-time picture of what's going on. I always remember watching or reading Tom Clancy books describing technology in the 80s of, where the president was looking at a real-time operation when that technology didn't exist. But today it does. You can watch your guys perform an operation in intimate detail, and you can control that operation, its tempo, its lethality, and everything. And so that enabling advantage of drones is just huge. We're seeing drones everywhere. And of course, we've had drones now for about 20 years. But the change that we've seen in the last 5 years is that suddenly the cost of drones and the fidelity of their sensors and their ability to fly very well indeed has improved, while the cost of these systems has come down. And a lot of that, of course, is due to that Chinese company, DJI. I mean, they were the first people really to sell a low-cost commercial drone, but it could deliver high-fidelity images, and fly very well and be very controllable. Because the early drones were difficult to fly, you can do things with a DJI drone now that you couldn't do with the British Army's Watchkeeper. When you think of the cost of that versus the cost of a DJI drone, that is revolutionary. That's not incremental. That's radical. So that's the second thing. Drone technology is huge. And I think the third element is the progression and innovation in artillery systems. And of course, artillery is still incredibly important. During World War I, it accounted for 75% of all casualties. Artillery, it was tube artillery and mortars. And it was the same in World War II. And funnily enough, it's the same again today in Ukraine. Artillery causing close to 80% of all casualties. And of course, if you count drones as artillery systems, I think many people do, then that argument especially holds true. So very, very powerful artillery systems have now come online. So we're seeing an increase in range, we're seeing an increase in precision, and we're seeing an increase in lethality. And also we're seeing an increase in the time to bring artillery on target. So counter-battery fire arrives much sooner, and you can adjust targets and prosecute targets much more quickly than before. So these are all, significant things that have created a much more lethal battlefield, very dangerous place to be for the infantry soldier. And I think the fourth element that I described is vehicle technology, and where you have vehicles that are connected so they can communicate easily with each other, where they can share information, and where they have better mobility. And the advent of 8x8 wheeled combat vehicles, I think, is particularly important, because suddenly you can project a force very quickly over long distances in a way that you couldn't before. So this capacity for an armored formation in wheeled vehicles to maneuver independently to achieve a given task, again, is a revolutionary thing. It first happened in 2003 when the US Army deployed the first Striker Brigade in Iraq. And now every army in NATO has got a medium weight capability, and it really does allow this very fast reaction. So those are the primary trends that I'm seeing, and I think they are extraordinary in the effect that they are allowing armies to achieve on the battlefield.
So what does this mean for the battlefield? I mean, in terms of how do armies have to adapt? I'm thinking in terms of tactics. I'm thinking in terms of doctrine. Like, if this is revolutionary, then what has to change?
Well, it's interesting when we think about how this doctrine has evolved. So the British Army wanted to completely renew its heavy war fighting capabilities. And people like Rusi were saying, well, actually, we can't afford to do this. And if we do it, we'll be depleted within, 3 months of fighting a high-end conflict scenario. So we won't have an army left. So really, we have to fight differently. And that is how much of this thinking evolved. And what we're moving towards doing now is fighting the deep battle instead of over the close battle. Mm-hmm. And the second thing that we're doing is we're fighting the first battle as opposed to the second battle. And I'll just unpack what I mean by those things. The first battle is where you deploy preemptively to prevent territory from falling into enemy hands. Because we didn't do that when Russia invaded Ukraine in Crimea in 2014, but we did do it in 2022. We knew the Russians were going to attack, and so the Ukrainians were able to deploy at an early stage and completely blunted that initial Russian assault. So that fighting the first battle, that requires the attacker to have a 3-to-1 advantage. So you, as a defender, you have that inherent numerical advantage that helps you when you don't have mass. So that's crucial. And of course, if you're forced to fight the second battle, it's you who needs the 3-to-1 advantage. So the second element of this is fighting the deep battle, and this is the artillery system. So your 8x8 vehicles are allowing you to deploy your army first to get there quickly. And then once you're getting there, you are using your drones and satellites and other sensors to spot where the enemy are. And you are hitting them at much longer distances. So you are avoiding the close battle. And when you attack the enemy, beyond their ability to return effective fire, you are avoiding suffering casualties yourself. So it's a great resilient strategy, as well as allowing you to significantly degrade the enemy's war-fighting potential. So those are the two things: fighting the first battle, deep battle, over the close battle, second battle, and we're doing that very effectively with these new systems. And of course, one thing that's new now, that's just coming online, is long-range cruise missiles that don't cost very much. And we're seeing this convergence between drones, launching munitions, and cruise missiles. So suddenly you can conduct these long-range attacks at very low cost, and that is incredible, because that, if you can achieve a mass effect, a swarm effect, then you really can cause significant damage, which can destroy an enemy force in place. So principally, that's what we're trying to do. But I want to qualify that. And while we want to deploy first and fight that deep battle, inevitably we are going to get overwhelmed with an enemy, with a determined enemy. And even with the best will in the world, Russia still managed to take almost 20% of Ukraine's territory. So you are going to have to fight the second battle, close battle, and you need to be equipped to do that. And to do that, you still need to fight using combined arms maneuver. And that is tanks, infantry, artillery, aircraft, all working together to literally blast a path through enemy defenses to dislodge them from their positions. So basically, that's how I see the battlefield evolving.
So it's interesting, because you're almost saying that there's a certain level in which the technology leads to sort of revolutionary things. There's a greater ability to do that first battle, greater ability to do the deep attack, the deep battle. But then ultimately you're going to have to counterattack, and the counterattack almost requires reverting back to an older form of doctrine, an older form of tactics.
And that's absolutely right, Michael. It does. And I think people thought we could fight the first battle, deep battle, exclusively over the close battle, second battle. And that was really the theory of victory in the initial stages of the Ukrainian conflict. And when they decided to mount their counterattack last year, 2023, they just didn't have the resources to do it, and they failed. So that's one of the reasons why it's become so attritional, because they're holding the Russians now, but neither side can really advance. So everything that you do in the initial stages really counts. Once you seize territory, it's very hard for your adversary to get it back. And it's very hard for you to, once the person you're attacking has settled into a defensive position, it's very hard to dislodge them as well.
So from what I gather, then the new technology is very helpful for making the first battle as effective as possible, that initial defensive battle. But then when it comes to the counterattack, then we're back to mass being the thing that matters most. And then the technologies, the revolutionary technologies almost become, I guess, less important. I mean, like the technology will enable you to do the first battle with relatively small forces, but they will not substitute for mass in the second battle, in the counterattack.
So if we look back to the First World War, what we were trying to do there was use artillery to obliterate an enemy position, so that by the time the troops advanced, there was nothing left to take. And in a way, we're hoping to do that with drones today. And I think it's wishful thinking. But I think actually, what we have to remember about drones is that they are still in their infancy. Even the best drones today are the equivalent of a First World War biplane compared to what they'll be in 10 or 20 years' time. Mm-hmm. I can see things where a situation where will be able, through our online presence, be able to get the DNA of every soldier on the battlefield and to have a drone designed to take out that specific soldier. It will go and search for him and kill him. And if you think of having millions of drones aimed at killing individual soldiers, they're each doing this on a swarm scale. That could change warfare dramatically. That mass effect. Of course, that's sort of an imaginative envisioning of what drones might be able to do in the future, but they will certainly be much more capable than they are now. And they will incorporate AI, they will incorporate algorithmic warfare, which is open source information being pulled by AI and then fed to your effectors to achieve this kind of effect.
I want to follow up with this idea about the second attack, the counterattack, where, as we said, there's a need for mass. And to some extent, there's a sort of a reversion for earlier technologies or earlier logic, maybe I should say. The one thing, though, that I'm struck by is how, and General Hubin wrote about this, about how there's this inversion between the need for concentration and the need for dispersion, which he talked about in terms of overturning previous thinking about economy of force versus concentration of means. And because concentration of means nowadays is actually lethal, like to actually concentrate force in order to attack an enemy, that exposes you to the kinds of fires that we're talking about. How do we do this? Like, let's say, how do you mount a counter attack without concentrating forces and then being wiped out?
Well, I would say you can't. You've got to have mass, because otherwise you're going to get nowhere. And that's, and we saw that last year. The Ukrainians were attacking at company and battalion level, but not at brigade and divisional level. Because there was that lack of mass over a wide enough front, they just never had the impact. It never had the sort of a shock effect that a really large force brings. And because when you're attacking across a wide front with a large force, the enemy doesn't know where the Schwerpunkt is going to be, where the real focus of the effort is going to be. And so doesn't know where to commit his reserves. So when you're not doing that, you just can't achieve that breakthrough effect. And of course, what we're presuming with using heavy armor for modern day counterattack is that heavy armor is still the best way to deliver troops to where they need to be. So if you have guys in an IFV, they will debus on the objective. They won't, if they have to fire a maneuver 100 or 200 meters, that's, they're going to pay a real price for doing that. So you want them to get as close to that target position as possible before they have to start using their own weapons and indulge in hand-to-hand combat.
So you said something interesting about how the enemy might not be able to see where, as you put it, the Schwerpunkt is of the attack. So the idea is that even with the kind of transparency that we see today in the modern battlefield, there's still this possibility of fostering uncertainty.
I think so, and I think that you can use cyber effects to mislead the enemy about what your intentions are. And of course, the other really interesting thing about cyber warfare and AI is that you can, if you can listen in on the enemy's transcripts or their logistical broadcasts and things like that, or even their commanders' surfing habits, you can begin to determine enemy intent from what they're doing. And if you can do that, then you can achieve a surprise effect. And you can, this sort of deliberate fooling of the enemy, deception on a grand scale. And I think the Russians have certainly tried that, and the Ukrainians have too. And of course, drones allow you to do that.
How so? How do drones function with that in that way?
Well, because you're using a drone swarm in one place, and people think, oh, right, they're going to attack here because they're using drones. But then, of course, they have an attack where the attacking force moves very stealthily, so almost invisibly arrives on the objective.
And you think that there's still the ability to move stealthily upon an objective?
Yes, I do. I mean, it's easy to get fooled by what's going on in Ukraine, thinking that's a norm, because it's become very attritional, very static. But in a proper war, it would be highly mobile, and so you would be hiding and then operating in contested areas. So areas would remain contested for longer periods than they did, because there would be more equality between the two forces fighting each other.
So I'm shocked by your word "proper war." It reminds me of I know that in the U.S. there's this tendency to think in terms of proper war and then what they used to call military operations other than war, which is somehow ironic because we kept fighting military operations other than war rather than that proper war that everybody kind of dreamed of and imagined. Yeah. That sort of which I guess we got to fight in 2003. That was the proper war that we were hoping to be able to fight. Why would we think that the next war or any kind of big war would be anything other than like in Ukraine? It would somehow be a proper war.
I think a proper war is a war for survival, and it's an existential conflict, and where the future of your own nation depends on that result. Anything else is discretionary, really. I mean, look at the Falklands that we fought in 1982. That was a discretionary war. It was not an existential war. And of course, Iraq and Afghanistan were the same. Whereas Ukraine is very much fighting an existential war. And I actually believe, from what I've seen, that if we let Russia win, Putin will carry on.
Right. That's at the end of that. I'm stuck, though. One of the things that General Hubin wrote about that I thought was super interesting was this idea that he was very convinced that the linearity of the battlefield was over. So there would no longer be linear battlefields, that the battlefields were ultimately going to be like chessboards where pieces are moving around and they're sort of mixed up together and they're maneuvering sort of among one another, which makes a lot of sense. And that's also where the modern networking technologies really come to the fore, because that's a kind of thing that would not have been possible in the past, because you would not have been able to keep track of where everybody was. And, you need a great degree of coordination and visibility. Hubin's vision is something that struck me as making a great deal of sense, like a non-linear battle. And also he talked about this in the sense that Western militaries are so small that they won't really have a choice. And it will be a lot more like 18th century wars where, before the French Revolution, these were very small militaries that were maneuvering around. You did not have linear battlefields or anything like that. On the other hand, Ukraine has become a very linear battlefield. It's very different from the way Hubin describes it. So what happened in Ukraine, and what are the conditions that we think would be different, such that any kind of other war that we're going to imagine involving NATO forces versus Russia would not be a linear war?
So I think during the initial stages of the war in Ukraine, it was very non-linear.
Yes.
And let's remember that Russia didn't just attack across a narrow front. It attacked across the whole length of the border in different places, hoping to achieve a breakthrough in one place or another. And of course, it did in places achieve a breakthrough. And so Hubin's vision was very much came to life in the early stages. But Ukraine's response was incredibly well coordinated, and it forced Russia to fight a linear war. If you look at the approach to Kiev, they flooded a whole plain, and that canalized the Russian forces down a single road. And then they destroyed the forces at the front and at the back, and nothing in the middle could move. And then through systematic use of artillery, they picked off every unit along that road, and they destroyed an entire Russian army, which was incredible. When the Russians attacked Hostomel airfield, again, because of the situational awareness and knowledge that they had of what the Russians were doing, it enabled them to defeat that force. And so at every level, Ukraine was able to respond. I mean, they completely outfought Russia in the initial stages. And if you like, Ukraine won the war in the first 3 months when it completely stopped the initial Russian assault. Russia literally had to go back to the drawing board and rethink its tactics. It couldn't fight a linear war. It had to be focused. And we saw these lines forming. And of course, why did this happen? Well, it's very simple. Because ultimately, if you're going to sustain combat operations, you depend on logistical efforts. And if anything undermines Hubin's theory, it is the need for logistic support to sustain the initiative.
That's right.
I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hubin argued, and I said this more for the audience, and I realize that the number of people who read Hubin is very small, but he made this argument about how historically forces were sustained through these very linear logistical chains, and the image that he invoked is of the voie sacrée, the truck train that fed the troops at Verdun with supplies, and it was just like this endless river of trucks just going up and down this one road. Which of course nowadays wouldn't be possible, because nowadays the enemy would have just decimated all those trucks that were on that road because it was this major target. But in 1916, the Germans didn't have that capability. But ultimately there's this forced linearity because of you have to supply units, and ultimately in order to supply units you have to go from point A to where those units are, and that's generally linear. Hubin made this argument that could be avoided through this great sort of transparency, and then also with this ability to, I think the word he used was to pulse, to just sort of provide, assuming that units are sort of scattered about the battlefield, moving around in different directions, right? So there's no linearity. And then the way is ultimately he imagined this ability to somehow supply these units as they're moving around with what they need, without creating that linear line between them and whatever home base it is that's the source of all this. And I would agree that that's something that he never really explains how that works, although he, like many others, put great faith in the idea that precision weapons translated into reduced logistical burdens. You no longer have to provide a howitzer piece with 1,000 shells per day, because now that howitzers are so much more accurate, they can achieve the same effect with, I don't know what the numbers are, I'm just making this up, 100 shells per day. But the logistical burden of 100 shells versus 1,000 shells is far easier. So everybody's firing precision weapons with great effect, which means that the overall logistical burden is smaller.
We're seeing that with HIMARS versus tube artillery. And the ATACMS missile that the Ukrainians are using to take out headquarters and logistical nodes, very effective and a really efficient way of attacking and really save that logistical burden. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. But ultimately, we're stuck with linearity, though. I mean, I guess that's part of your point, that at some point linearity then happens because you need the logistical support.
Because logistics are very linear. You have your central...
Inescapably.
Exactly. But it's funny, when we talk about the idea of it, we've traditionally had 4 phases of war. So we have the attack and advance, we have the withdrawal and defense. And now, to your point, we have this bit where we're in the middle, like chess pieces, in contested area that nobody controls, where we're hiding and searching for the enemy. And it's almost like encounter warfare, where you're searching and destroying the enemy, and they're trying to do the same for you. And that's completely new. And I think that's what Hubin was referring to. And I think that is relevant. But I think you will, once you have sustained casualties and you need to regroup, you will revert to a kind of linearity, because you need a line that you can defend, because you're trying to prevent a breakthrough. Because war is fundamentally about seizing and holding contested ground.
Invariably, the implication is that invariably, as the longer war goes on, the more linear it's going to become. And maybe then there's an interest in trying to preserve the nonlinearity as much as possible, to preserve the movement, to preserve this sort of chessboard-like state of play. But sooner or later, the linearity is going to impose itself.
Yeah, I don't have any data points to say empirically that's what's going to happen. But
Okay.
Intuitively, I think, yes, you could be right. I mean, we have seen the Ukrainian war become much more linear. But if the West were fighting a war against Russia or, God forbid, China, it would be non-linear to begin with. But then, once a lot of damage had been done, you would reach a negotiation stage much more quickly. Because I don't think we're dealing with a rational person in Putin. I mean, all the Russian analysts got it wrong because they said they could see no upside through his invasion of Ukraine. Yet he did it anyway. And look at the casualties that he suffered. You'd think it was no logical, sane person would continue to do what he's doing. Yet he carries on. So in one sense, the whole analysis of the war is skewed by not dealing with a non-rational dictator.
Right. Well, I'm inclined to agree with you on that. And I think that actually applies to many conflicts around the world, that we tend to project a rationality because they are rational. It's a different kind of rationality. There's no sort of objective rationality. But so what I'm thinking then is that what enables Russia to carry on is ultimately its mass, the fact that its military is large enough and its population is large enough that it can sustain these horrific losses. And so I'm trying to imagine a situation. Let's say, imagine in the near future there's a war and involving at least some of the Western heavyweights, right? The French are involved, the Germans are involved, the Poles are involved, maybe the Italians, and each of these have units. And I've written this before. Like I've argued that like the French could dance around the Russians and just completely slaughter them for a few days. And then what happens, right? So there'd be this really bloody first phase of that war in which the Western militaries would be able to avail themselves of all their technological advantages and all the sort of the savoir-faire that comes from this sort of high degree of professionalism that I think all the NATO militaries have. But at some point, that no longer works, if for no other reason than the fact that they just run out of stuff. They, shells to fire, missiles to fire, and they cannot survive the attrition. And then you get an attrition war, and then in an attrition war, the Russians are going to win that war. Is there a way for Western militaries to escape that?
One of the problems Western militaries have got is that their equipment is way too sophisticated and expensive, and it cannot be replaced quickly. So we have to get into a mindset now of producing low-cost stuff. So we've got companies like Anduril in the States who are producing low-cost loitering munitions and other systems, and they're doing it at scale. So we would have to get into that very quickly. And if you realize you had to mobilize industry, you could really get them moving quickly to really start churning out drones like ammunition. And that's really what's happening in Ukraine, and that's made a huge difference. We wouldn't be using expensive tanks and IFVs. We'd be using cheap MRAPs based on commercial trucks, but with an armored cab. I'm thinking of the company I advise, KNDS, makes a vehicle called Dingo, and this is an MRAP based on the Unimog chassis. It's very good off-road mobility, also very well protected. And I can see us needing to use those. So very simple, easy to produce weapons, equipment to make up for losses.
But we
have to train soldiers very quickly.
We keep buying expensive things. I mean, like if you look at all the infantry fighting vehicles that everybody's buying now, just across the board, whether they're French or American or German. I was just reading about. Well, I just did a video about the Australians and they're buying this Korean, what's it called, the Redback infantry fighting vehicle. They're all wonderful. They're all very expensive, and I could see how difficult of a sell it would be. Imagine if you're a military and to basically turn around and say, well, we're not going to buy the best possible infantry fighting vehicle. We're going to buy something that's just cruder, cheaper, simpler, kind of the Sherman tank, if you will, rather than the Wunderwaffen, the Tiger tank. That seems to be a solution, but almost politically untenable. Or, I mean, there's so much resistance to doing that. And we keep just doing this race to the, not the bottom, but the top in terms of the most exquisite weapons possible.
You're right, but I think that if we got involved in a serious war that lasted beyond 6 months, you would have no choice but to produce the low-cost armored vehicle, and they would be crude and simple, and low cost. They would have to be, because the other thing that's going on in Ukraine, these new IFVs, they're enormous. Boxer is an enormous vehicle,
huge.
And you want something much smaller and much less expensive. But of course, the thing with armored vehicles that they need to protect against FPV drones and artillery fragments, so they don't need to be highly protected. They need a certain level of protection, yes, but they don't need to be a 60-ton behemoth. You can do it with a moderate amount of protection.
And yet you also have, right. So then what is the right mix, let's say, if we were to just redesign an army from scratch? Do we still need 70-ton behemoths like the main battle tanks that everybody has now?
I would say an army typically should be 3 divisions, a peacetime army from a leading European country. You'd expect England, Germany, France all to have 3 divisions each. And of those, I would have 1 heavy division, 1 medium, and 1 light. It's as simple as that. So the majority would be the lighter, more maneuverable, more agile forces, but you would have the maneuver force in heavy tracked armor to conduct this slogging match with the enemy to retake lost ground.
So ultimately, you need the heavy stuff for the slogging match, for the counterattack.
I think you still need it. Yeah, I don't think you want to lead with it, and I think the idea of leading with it now is wrong. If it's on tracks, it doesn't deploy quickly anyway. So you're going to deploy your lighter, less well protected forces, and they're going to dig in and going to move their vehicles away, and they will rely on handheld anti-tank weapons and artillery to defeat the enemy. They will literally form a line that will stop the enemy, and then you'll have cavalry operating forward to spot for artillery and to use loitering munitions.
That sounds like a very conventional formula, however, right? So like far afield from the kind of non-linear battle space that we were talking about with these units sort of moving around. I forgot U-Bound's term, like isometric or isotropic, where everybody's going to be moving around different angles. So it's like, again, we're reverting to linearity at some level.
Well, so, the enemy will concentrate his forces. He will have a main objective, and you have to try and drive him into a killing zone. And you'll do that by having pockets of forward resistance that will force the enemy to maneuver around you to make progress. And hopefully you will drive him into that location that will allow you to deplete to the maximum effect.
I see. And you force the enemy to concentrate wherever possible.
Yeah, you do. Either by using the terrain to your advantage, or the enemy's reluctance to sustain casualties, forcing a withdrawal, knowing that they'll have to get the only other route that they can go, or think that they can go, you've got covered with long-range artillery missiles.
Right. There's a really great French defense journalist named Jean-Dominique Mercier, who wrote this wonderful book called Are We Ready for War? And he writes about all of these things. And he writes about the fact that, the French military is really great, very capable, but at the end of the day, it's too small. And at the end of the day, like the industrial production rates, production capacity is extremely limited and often has like 1 or 2 choke points. It talks about how, like, for the howitzer shell manufacturing, there's like 1 machine and only 1 machine that can do this one thing that you need to do in order to make howitzer shells. And there's just 1 of them, right? And what if that breaks or gets sabotaged or something? And just in terms of the production rates of the Caesar howitzer and of Dassault, the Rafale, the fact that nobody produces main battle tanks anymore, so like nothing can be replaced, and the only real cure for any of this is by spending just gigantic sums of money, which is just never going to happen. You almost have to put like French or British defense, and everything he says, I believe, is relevant for Britain. Absolutely everything. You have to get spending up to like 4% in order to 4% GDP in order to start investing in the kind of industrial capabilities and the kinds of the scale that you need. And he concludes by saying, well, that's just never going to happen. And so what do you do? So one argument that he raises is that, well, maybe it's okay because at the end of the day, how plausible is it really that we're going to find ourselves in a major war?
Mhm.
Right. And he asks, where? What are the scenarios in
Can I
which?
just push back against his
Please.
narrative? So let's supposing Trump cuts a deal with Putin,
Mhm.
and Putin stops where he is now with the territory he's taken, and a new border is drawn, and peace is announced. And then Russia's army stays where it is, and we think, for 6 months we have this happy period where we think everything's okay. And then we find out that China and North Korea are re-equipping Russia with huge amounts of new battle tanks, new artillery systems, drone production starts stepping up, artillery production start, and so we see Putin tooling up for another go. What are we going to do? We will have to respond, and I think at that point we will decide, hey guys, we need to start spending 3 or 4% of GDP on defense.
That makes
But
sense.
again, we're going to have to design things that are easy and quick to produce, because we'll realize that time will not be on our side.
Sometimes I share your pessimism. Sometimes I don't. I think it changes from day to day. But I certainly do think that scenario is possible. But then there's this question: what would Russia do? I mean, that's a whole other debate. Picking on a non-NATO country is one thing. Going for a NATO country is another thing altogether. But if Trump does his thing, given the disunity within NATO, I could see how he could gamble that there would not be a unified response, because everything would depend on a unified NATO response. But if NATO is badly divided and America's out to lunch, that's also in my mind where the analogy comes to the late 1930s. The fact that Britain, France, and the United States were not united and were distracted by various things, and thus he was able to gamble that you could grab the Rhineland, you can grab this, that, and the other thing, knowing that there would not be a vigorous united response amongst the great powers against him until he went too far and invaded Poland. But even then, there was no real vigorous response. Another thing that Jean-Dominique says, though, at the conclusion of his book that I thought was super interesting is that after expressing pessimism and saying, okay, like France isn't going to spend 4%, and he's got some confidence that these scenarios could happen but aren't likely. But ultimately, what he ends up with is the idea that what really the last best hope is just to have confidence in the nation. So again, he's writing about France, but I think his arguments are relevant for other countries. Like he talks about what happened in World War I after the Battle of the Marne, the first Battle of the Marne, that France escaped, absorbed, and then was able to move on and was able to mobilize and do what it took. And so for him, it amounted to resilience. Like he thought that's really ultimately what will save the day, which I think is an interesting point. Although the skeptic in me thinks, well, how do you build resilience into a system? How do you plan for resilience? And also, resilience doesn't only get you so far if things move quickly enough. So, for instance, France in 1940 did not have resilience and therefore fell, did not have the resilience that it had in 1914. I mean, of course, there are other factors in play, but is that sort of ultimately the answer? Like, it's sort of like, because we're not going to spend 4%, we're going to end up, we have these armies that are exquisite, but they're too small. They're going to get hammered. And our hope is that they survive long enough for some sort of Battle of the Marne effect, wherein they kind of hold the line, or maybe the Ukrainians or the Kiev offensive. They're able to stop it, hold the line long enough for them to get their acts together and to respond and to crank up some sort of response. Is that kind of our best hope? And is that that point that we're spending 4% or even above?
I always think the reason we had 2% of GDP and exquisite armies was because we always thought all they needed to do was buy negotiating time before we used nuclear weapons.
That's true. Yes.
And of course, now people realize if we use nuclear weapons, it's the end of the world. It's game over. We're back to the Stone Age, And so we really need to avoid that. And I think what that is doing now is making people say, you can't. If you must have nuclear weapons, but you still have to invest in conventional deterrence, because if you don't invest in conventional weapons, you reach a point where you have to use nuclear weapons much sooner than you might otherwise.
Which is the last thing anybody wants.
Yeah. So
right.
I think this is really what the situation in Ukraine has created amongst NATO armies, is this need to spend more so that you can draw this red line that can't be crossed. So I think we may not reach 4%, but we will spend more to beef up what we have. I mean, let's think, during the Cold War, the British Army was 160,000 and now it's 73,000, but the threat is greater. That doesn't make sense.
Do you think the threat is greater now than it was during the Cold War?
Oh, yes, it is.
And it's because of this set of nuclear taboo that we have, that means that for some reason that nuclear weapons are no longer the guarantee against large-scale conventional war.
Nobody's going to use them. Are you, the question everybody said at the beginning of the Ukraine war is, are we going to start World War III or let Ukraine go? We're going to let Ukraine go because we don't want to start World War III. That was the thinking.
That is the thinking that one hears a lot, particularly amongst the sort of the isolationist wing of the Trump world. Yeah. That's the argument one hears.
So nuclear war is very scary, but Putin may yet resort to nuclear weapons. That is terrifying. Mm-hmm. When he's got nothing else left, what will he do? The amount of conventional force that he has depleted is mind-boggling. Number of vehicles, tanks, artillery systems that he's lost, just quite unbelievable. So again, no normal person would allow that to happen to themselves before quitting.
So one thing we have not talked about is air power. And I also find it interesting that air power is not discussed much at all in any of the commentary about the Ukraine war. It's almost as if it's not going on. The focus, everybody talks about ground forces, everybody talks about drones. So what do you see, both in terms of trends of air power, but also what the place of air power now in the modern battlefield?
Well, so it all comes down to air defense systems and having air superiority. And we look at Gulf War I back in 1990. We didn't move on the ground until we had fought an air war for a very long period of time. Mm-hmm. And we absolutely decimated targets from the air with huge effect. And we continue to do that today. So, air power is incredibly important. I don't know that we're going to touch upon the importance of the Army relative to the Navy and Air Force, but air power is extremely important. And of course, we've talked about drones, and in one sense, they democratize air power because they are low-cost air power. But you still need a sophisticated combat aircraft with stealth capabilities that can evade enemy radars to take out the enemy's air defense systems so that you can have air superiority. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, we've sort of seen it to a limited effect in Ukraine, but we've hardly seen the Russian Air Force at all. It hasn't bombarded Ukraine positions. And that's because the Ukraine forces have been very well dispersed. So when they attack by air, they're just exposing their aircraft to anti-aircraft fire.
One thing that bothers me is in terms of the Western military. Western militaries have not had any experience of operating without air superiority, which potentially changes everything. I mean, like there was this Marine Corps general who he made some comments recently that everybody jumped on social media about how we have this recent combat experience, but China hasn't fought a war since the 1950s, which of course is quite true. But also I was thinking, well, the last time the U.S. did not have air superiority was, I think, Guadalcanal. And I don't know, I think that potentially changes everything if it's not a given. So do we even know how to operate anymore when we're in areas in which we don't have air superiority?
Well, I think the drone gives us some form of air superiority, makes up for that. We will have drones and drones in quantity. So we will use air power in a different way. I think we will use it more strategically than operationally. So we will bomb their cities, we will take out their command network using air power, long-range strike, things like that. Mm-hmm. And we will prevent their bombers from attacking our cities. But actually on the battlefield, will we have close air support? Not in the way we used to. And also, by the same token, I think I wouldn't want to use attack helicopters. I think they don't have a place anymore, in my view.
That's interesting. Okay. But everybody's buying them. I mean, the Poles have placed a large order for Apaches, and everybody's spending a lot of money. You think that they're too easy targets?
Yeah. So, the ubiquity of drones has forced everyone to invest in air defense systems. So we're seeing air defense cannons make a big comeback. Mm-hmm. Small 30 millimeter and large 30 millimeter. We're seeing man-portable missiles like Stinger and Starstreak. And our enemies have these as well as we having them. And if they can take out drones, you can bet your bottom dollar they can take out attack helicopters. And people say, oh, well, they'll stand well back and they'll launch long-range missiles. Well, you don't need a $40 million helicopter to do that. To do it with a 40,000-pound loitering munition. And so, will you use them for reconnaissance? No, you're going to use drones for reconnaissance.
Right.
What you will use helicopters for is for delivering soldiers where there are no enemy, for doing CASEVAC, for doing logistical work, but not as frontline combat machines. Just too vulnerable. That's my view.
So you made a comment that I feel like we should pick up, that there's a thread we should pull here, which has to do with the relative values of the Army versus the Navy and the Air Force. Now, in Britain's case, there have been a number of people who have argued. In fact, I've argued this, that given fiscal realities and also sort of Britain's classic role historically, that ultimately made more sense for the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force to grab the lion's share of defense spending. And while it's regrettable that the Army is withered, that maybe that's okay as long as the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force are alive and healthy and robust. But I know that you push back against that.
Yeah, no, and I don't push back against it, actually. Well, I will, but in a way that you might not expect. So as an island nation, we depend on vital supplies reaching us by sea and increasingly by air. So we have to prioritize the Navy to keep up the sea lanes and UK approaches clear. That's very important. Although increasingly, I think that should be done with submarines, not with surface vessels. I think we should have a much larger submarine fleet than we do. Equally, I think the Air Force has a very important role in protecting UK skies, as well as conducting maritime patrol for counter-submarine work. And of course, naval and air assets are very expensive. So yes, they should get the lion's share of the defence budget. But that doesn't mean we can't have an army. And I think we've let the army shrink too much now. And I think we need to get it back to a decent state. And once we've done that, it will look after itself. I mean, when you look at most of our stuff, it's the Army's equipment, it's more than 40 years old. You need to replace that stuff. And it's not being extravagant to do it. It was just criminal that the Army was allowed to atrophy to the extent that it has. And it's not, at the moment, it's not effective. I think, I'd just done some recent analysis and I worked out that we could basically deploy 2 brigades out of the 8 we are meant to have. The rest is will never get there.
Right. 2 brigades that also, if they're eaten up, it'd be very difficult to replace.
Yeah.
And it's a long process, too. It's been going on for 30, 40 years, or really, at the very least, since the end of the Cold War, the atrophying of the British military.
Yeah. And, what didn't help was that the Army utterly failed to deliver Ajax and the Warrior upgrade program. So, it was just too ambitious in what it tried to do with the amount of money that had been allocated. If it had gone from much simpler off-the-shelf systems, it would have saved itself a world of pain. That Ajax project, Ajax is, I don't know, it's supposed to work now. I don't know if it works or not. But, I know people who've worked closely on it, and they say it's got to a point where it can enter service. But
that's faint praise, right? When you say off the shelf, do you mean off the shelf foreign or off the shelf whatever the British industry had to offer at the time?
Off the shelf foreign. If you're putting a turret on a vehicle, you've got Kongsberg in Norway, you've got the Germans, you've got the Israelis, and you've got America, all make good turrets. Why did we have to develop a new turret for Ajax and Warrior? And this 40mm cannon, the caliber that no one else uses. This is a vanity project by generals who have too much money and too much time. So very bad choices.
But is there an imperative, though, to invest to make the off the shelf, to make your own stuff for the sake of putting the money into the British defense industry so that you still have a defense industry, rather than letting go your own defense industry because you're buying foreign stuff?
The thing is, we've let go of our defense industry. It's completely gone.
It's done.
So how do you bring it back? You buy something off a shelf from a foreign power that you like, and then you say you're going to manufacture it in the UK. And in the process of manufacturing it in the UK, you redevelop, let's say, a turret expertise, a tracked vehicle expertise or whatever. But you can't just go there from nowhere, because you'll just fail every time. Because you've got 3 risk factors. You've got cost, time, and capability. And if you want a really good capability and you haven't got much time, it's going to cost through the roof. And similarly, you know what I mean.
Absolutely. It's a common problem that I see with all the European powers, and then also
because rebuilding an industry in any particular area, it's a 10-year exercise to do it in peacetime. I mean, in war you could probably do it much quicker, but you have to throw resource at it.
enormous amounts of money. I think one thing that we need to talk about, which is something I don't think people are talking about enough, is the nuclear angle here. There's also sort of the nuclear risk, the risk of nuclear weapons in the Russia context, and also the question of where are we with nuclear deterrence and how much does it actually matter? Sometimes it seems as if it doesn't matter, that nuclear deterrence doesn't stop anything, although I suppose it stops nuclear war. Maybe from that, then there's also the question of the value of Britain's nuclear deterrence, which, as you know, eats up a very large portion of the British defense budget.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on? I don't know where you want to start, but
on balance, I think we should keep it. But if you're going to have a nuclear deterrent, you have to accept you're going to have to spend more overall on defence to have it. Otherwise, you can't maintain your conventional forces. And I think if Britain today did not have nuclear weapons, I think Russia could be a much greater threat to us. They could attack us directly. Take out an airfield to tell us to keep quiet, keep up, mind our own business. So I think nuclear weapons ultimately back up NATO. They create this sort of staged response throughout the alliance.
And you think there's a value to Britain having nuclear weapons in France as well as the United States, and not relying on the US?
We can use them independently of America. If America, because what happened if we got into a situation where America was not involved and we had to defend ourselves and couldn't use our nuclear weapons? It would be disastrous.
That would be really bad. Right, I agree. Well, Nicholas, thank you so much. This has really been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on
I enjoy our chats because we share a lot of thoughts, of the same ideas,
So anyways, thank you very much for joining me, and hopefully we'll do this again. And good luck. I saw that you've also started your own YouTube channel, so I'm putting a link to the description to your YouTube channel as well as to your excellent blog. And so I would encourage everybody to check both out. So thank you. And for you, the audience, I look forward to seeing you in my next video.